The mandate of heaven is upon us, and with it, a whole bunch of new heroes to employ. In this video, we're going to take a look at each of these new generals up close and personal to see what they can do, focusing on their battle prowess and abilities, nothing to do with the campaigns. So if you're looking for that sort of campaign information, you'll have to look elsewhere. Some of these characters do come with their own campaign as a faction, or they're simply recruitable out in the world. So, let us begin. First up, He Jian, a general under the Han Emperor Liu Chong. He comes with the Imperial Army in the campaign and can recruit Imperial units in custom battles, and seems to be the only person who can do so, and as you can imagine with Imperial troops, they are very strong. And as for the man himself, as a sentinel he is pretty tough, so he's got a lot of melee evasion, decent armor, fair damage of both kinds. For his abilities, he's got the Sacrificial Strike, which will sacrifice some of his health but will do a lot of damage in a splash attack. He also has a couple of defensive abilities and a charge negation, so he's got a few things going on for him, but overall a very tough sentinel. Next up, Prince Liu Chong, family to the Han Emperor. He gladly makes efforts to support his kin, but doesn't neglect his own people in the process, and as such is loved by his people for it. In battle, he is unbreakable first of all, has fairly average damage output in melee, but is very tough with lots of armor and melee evasion, and as he's come strapped with a bow, he's got a nice ranged attack as well. He's got a couple of defensive abilities to help protect his people, as commanders do, and the Show of Force missile attack, which will not only damage its target, but reduce morale as well. So a nice tough commander with some ranged options. Now for another sentinel, Huangfusong. A good honest man, loyal to his leader, Lu Zhi. In battle, some tough typical sentinel stats, lots of melee evasion, lots of armor, a little bit more melee damage output than some, but much like the previous hero, he comes with a ranged attack as well, which again has some nice damage on it. For his abilities, he has a melee evasion buff and the Hail of Arrows, which not only damages enemies, but also debuffs their charge speed, ranged attack rate, melee attack rate, and charge bonus. So, a nice versatile sentinel with some ranged options. So to Lu Zhi himself, Huangfusong's commander. He is a strategist first of all, so you can expect him to be pretty rubbish in the melee, although he does have a fair bit of base damage, which is surprising. Although do remember that this is kind of early access beta stuff, so some things may change. Don't be surprised if that number should go down. But strategists of course are all about their abilities. He has Turning the Tide, which is enabled if there is an enemy unit routing nearby, and it gives range damage and melee damage and morale to nearby friendly troops. He also has Stifling Deluge, which increases enemy cooldown time. And the last thing of note, he does have Guerrilla Deployment as well for his retinue, so he could get a little bit sneaky. And on to one of the four beauties of China, Diaochan, mostly known for being the broad that Lu Bu killed his adopted dad for. As a strategist, her melee skills of course aren't up to much, although she has a fair amount of melee evasion somehow, and a little bit of missile protection. For her abilities, she has Inspiring Surge and Stifling Deluge, and Heavenly Grace, which immobilizes nearby troops, reducing their melee evasion and armor, so that could be very powerful, stunning the enemies in place and then using missiles to blast them down or cavalry to charge them up, sure. And she also has Guerrilla Deployment as well, so she could set up some sneaky traps by comboing that Guerrilla Deployment and Heavenly Grace. So a beautiful strategist to have in your army, although don't you think for a second about trying to marry her, otherwise Lu Bu's coming after you. And our final strategist of the day, Xun You. He is a strategist, so melee blah blah blah. For his abilities, he's got Stifling Deluge, Inspiring Surge, and Wisdom of the River, which will reduce melee evasion and armor of all nearby enemy units. He can also provide Guerrilla Deployment to his retinue. So a tidy strategist with some nice enemy debuffs. Now to our Yellow Turban boys with Liang, the vanguard of the Yellow Turbans, tasked with defending against those trying to prevent the rebellion. He's a veteran hero with a whole lot of armor piercing damage, but severely lacking in the melee evasion. So while he can put the hurt on people himself, he can't take a great deal of punishment. Abilities wise, he has Lord of the People, which will be enabled if he has less than 20% health, which will give 50 morale and 10 armor to nearby units. He also has Way of War, which will increase melee evasion and melee damage over time the longer he's fighting, but not just for himself but for his allies as well. And Tempered Deflection for increasing missile block chance. He's also pretty spooky with scare and has guerrilla deployment, so a good supporting veteran with some hefty damage output. Another yellow turban brother, Zhang Bao, a determined and ambitious warmonger looking to aggressively expand the influence of the yellow turbans. A veteran who is unbreakable, but with only average defense and attack stats, to be honest. For his abilities, he's got Nature's Ally, which will give him and his troops a speed and morale buff when going through the forest, as well as ignore forest penalties. He has the Way of Thunder ability, which will increase the ranged attack rate and melee attack rate of nearby troops, provided he's not in melee. And the Lord of the Land melee splash attack, which does a bunch of splash damage and reduces enemy melee evasion. So a supportive veteran, great at fighting or flanking from perhaps the trees. And finally, the Supreme General of Heaven, Zhang Jue, the man who mustered his brothers and disgruntled population against the Han Empire. He is the healer class, a little bit squishy with not a lot of armor, okay melee evasion, some decent base damage, and is unbreakable. For his abilities, he has Lord of Heaven, which, if and when he should die, he will give 25 morale to all his nearby troops rather than them losing it. He will inspire them with his martyrdom. He also has Way of Great Peace, which will increase morale, ranged block chance and melee evasion to nearby units when he's not in melee. So a great supporting healer, especially if he should die, although that's probably not ideal, but he can inspire his troops and keep them fighting or help them fight for longer by protecting them, as you would expect from the leader of the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Now, I should also mention that these new Yellow Turban generals come with their own army, a whole new roster of units, different and separate from the other Yellow Turban army that we got in the previous Yellow Turban DLC, as well as a bunch of other new units for all the normal non-Yellow Turban factions. Now, with that information in mind, I come to you with a question just relating to me. Normally, I cover these units in a video and go through them and talk about them, just like I've done with the generals in this video. However, I opted not to do that for this DLC because, well, I'm not really sure anyone cares. Do you care about all the different units? Are you disappointed I didn't do a video like I normally do of it? Or are you just not fussed? I feel like people like getting into the generals and all the different individual heroes, but they're not too fussed about the units. So let me know your thoughts, as it may affect future content. And I know most of my channel is Warhammer based, so most of you don't care about Three Kingdoms content, and that's fine, just ignore the question. But for those who do play 3K, let me know. I hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, I will see you in the future.